Africa's demand for the return of its stolen artifacts is gathering renewed urgency. Egypt has launched a vigorous campaign to reclaim one of its most iconic artifacts, the 3,400-year-old bust of Queen Nefertiti. The relic is currently housed in Berlin's Neues museum. Nefertiti's bust draws thousands of visitors to the museum in Germany each year, but Egyptians want it back with them in her original homeland. So this week on the program, we ask, why is Germany reluctant to hand back the relic? We also look at why, after decades of efforts by many African countries, only a few artifacts have been returned. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. A renowned Egyptian archaeologist has embarked on a campaign to force the return of one of the country's most treasured artifacts. Dr. Zahi Hawas says the bust of Queen Nefertiti was taken illegally by the Germans in the early 20th century, a claim denied in Berlin, where the iconic piece is currently on display. It is part of a much broader campaign across Africa to have the continent's stolen heritage returned. CGTN's Adel Mahroui tells us more.
Nearly 3,400 years old, the bust of Queen Nefertiti is an icon of Egyptian history, but a victim of European colonization more than a century ago. It's currently far from home. Germany says the bust for the most beautiful Egyptian queen was obtained legally. Egyptian archaeologists disagree. They claim foul play and demand its swift return.
After investigation, we learned that Nefertiti's bust left Egypt after it had been manipulated. Royal pieces were not allowed to leave Egypt, neither were limestone statues. Borchardt covered the statue with gypsum and covered the bust colors. So on paper, it's legal, but the manipulated design and description of the piece was the reason behind that.
The unique piece of Queen Nefertiti is estimated to be worth 400 million euros. Her historical value, though, is priceless, with the bust reflecting the charm and beauty of one of the few female leaders in ancient times who is still sparking controversy. It has also revived debates about the number of treasured Egyptian antiquities the colonial powers got their hands on in the late 1800s and early 1900s.
The number of Egyptian antiquities abroad is gigantic. The British Museum alone has 100,000 pieces. Most museums of the world have Egyptian antiquities. You'll find them in Berlin, Frankfurt, Manhattan, Torino, and Boston. During that time, a museum would not have been considered international unless it obtained Egyptian treasures.
Among the most demanded ancient Egyptian relics is the Rosetta Stone in the British Museum, the stone that helped decipher the hieroglyphics, the ancient Egyptian writings. And the statue of Hem-Ilu, the engineer who designed and built the Great Pyramid, is also in Germany. Both are unique items.
Egypt's frustrations to bring Nefertiti's bust back were renewed when the Grand Egyptian Museum requested the ancient queen on loan for its special opening, but the Neues museum rejected their approach. The campaign to bring her back, though, is through independent organizations who are seeking the government's support. Meanwhile, archaeologist Zahi Hawas, a key figure in the campaign, earlier told CGTN that he's working on an even bigger project. He's hunting what, if discovered, would be way more valuable than the bust, Nefertiti herself.
September 1st, to continue our search in Saqqara to search for the new pyramid of Huni, and also to continue our excavation in the Golden City and the search for the tomb of Queen Nefertiti in the Valley of the Kings.
Until then, Nefertiti's statue will remain iconic and unrivaled, and for now, thousands of miles away from home. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Well, I'm now joined by Dr. Zahi Hawas, a renowned Egyptian archaeologist and the driving force behind the campaign to return Queen Nefertiti's bust to Egypt. Dr. Hawas, thank you for joining me on the program. Let me begin by asking you, Queen Nefertiti's bust is still incredibly famous worldwide. Why do you think her image continues to captivate so many people today? And what is its significance for Egypt?
No, it's still the bust of Nefertiti is the most beautiful masterpiece of art ever came from ancient Egypt. If you look at any statue from the Old Kingdom or the Middle Kingdom, still Nefertiti is the most beautiful object that ever came from a site. And this is why this bust is very important to Egypt.
Now, Egypt has attempted since the early 1920s, if we go back to history, to retrieve the bust of Nefertiti. Why and at what point did you get involved in the pursuit of these artifacts?
In 2010, I found out that this bust of Nefertiti left Egypt illegally. We collected all the evidence, and I sent a letter in January 2nd, 2011, to ask for the return of the bust of Nefertiti. But after that, the revolution happened in Egypt. I could not continue. But now I found out that the European now began to think that they destroyed the monuments of Africa. Macron, the president of France, said that we have to return back the artifacts of the Africans. I found out it's time now to write a petition to be signed by Egyptians and people from all over the world to ask for the return of the bust of Nefertiti, because it's very important. Its home should be the Grand Museum and not Berlin Museum.
So why have you taken that responsibility and that role to push for the return of Queen Nefertiti's artifact?
I think I'm considered to be the guardian of the Egyptian civilization, and this is why it's my duty as the former minister of antiquities. It's my duty to return this bust back, and I can see that our president is supporting the campaign, the national campaign of returning stolen artifacts.
Right. What is the success rate of the return of Egyptian artifacts, and what has been achieved after years of agitating for their return?
Because if we discover any artifact that was stolen from Egypt, then we go through the auction halls and return this piece back. We returned many pieces. I myself returned back 6,000 artifacts back to Egypt. But again, there is 3 new artifacts, major ones. Their home should be in Egypt, such as the Rosetta Stone from the British Museum, the Zodiac from the Louvre, and also the bust of Nefertiti from Berlin. We need only the 3 unique objects that are the icon of our Egyptian identity to come back to Egypt. And you have, and many Chinese artifacts are all over. It should come back to China. It's a time now for every country has to ask for the return of their objects to be back to the country of origin.
And finally, what do you believe, Dr. Hawas, what do you believe the future holds for campaigns like this one? Is there a realistic hope that Queen Nefertiti and other stolen treasures will one day return to Africa?
I really think that the popular request, the request among the Egyptian people and people from all over, can really support the cause. If we have signatures of 1 million, I need the Chinese people to help me and sign this petition and go to my website, hawaszahi.com. I am sure if I get 1 million signatures, I will return the bust of Nefertiti back. Its home should be the Grand Museum in Egypt.
All right, Dr. Hawas, thank you very much. Well, let's now broaden our discussion and look at Africa's request for the return of the continent's artifacts. Joining us from London via Zoom, Professor Abba Issa Tijani, former Director General of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in Nigeria, and in Lusaka, Ngaire Blackenberg, Founder and Executive Director, Creative Repair Studio. A warm welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us in this discussion. Professor Tijani, let me start off with you. More than 90% of sub-Saharan artistic heritage are said to be currently housed outside the continent as a result of colonial occupation in the 19th century, in the 20th century. And for a century, African countries have been demanding a return of these artifacts, but there have been obstacles. What is the origin of the row between African countries and museums in Europe and the United States?
I think the whole issue about illicit trafficking and in some cases forceful removal of artifacts from countries in Africa has been a major issue for both the profession and also the various institutions that hold this museum, these objects. It's been a very unfortunate situation, and we have raised our voice to see that these objects returned. But the problem with the Western countries, the US and other countries, is that they think that these objects should not be returned because we don't have the facilities, we don't have the professional capability, to look after these objects. And our own argument on one side is these objects are taken out illegally, and more so, these objects have been in these countries decades, without any problem. So why would there be a problem now when these objects are returned to these countries? So of course, we have the capability, we have the infrastructure to look after our objects. And most of these objects are not just for artistic, reason. They are rituals and for, part of the livelihood of the communities.
Ngaire, let me come to you here. What is it that is hindering the return of African artifacts from foreign museums?
Probably the most important is really political will on one level or of another. I think many museum directors are empowered to do it themselves, but others are not. They're bound by legislation, so that has to go through the courts, and so somebody has to be willing to push that through and get that approved. So I think, it's a matter of will, and it's a matter of intent, and it's a matter of speed. Look, I think that in many different other issues, if it comes to oil or terrorism or security or aid or development, there is a flexibility and a speed with which European countries and governments have proven that they can act. For this issue, for some reason, there's been a lot of dragging of feet. And so I do think that comes down to the will to get it done.
Professor Tijani, I want to address that issue of Africa's capability for storing the objects, as you earlier alluded, because in 2021, Germany returned 22 Benin bronzes to Nigeria as part of that larger effort by the West to seek reparation of stolen artifacts from Africa. So what has been the reception of these pieces back at home in Nigeria? How have they been stored? What has it meant?
First of all, I must say that we need to understand that these objects, before they were illegally taken out of the country, they were safe and have been there for decades without any problem. So today we have advanced, and many African countries have museums, and many are, preparing to build new facilities. So therefore, that should not be a reason in the first place. And when I was the Director General of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in Nigeria, we signed the agreement with Germany, for example, that you mentioned, where, all the 1,130 Benin bronzes in various public museums in Germany were to be returned to Nigeria. And they mentioned about these facilities, and I said that the condition of our agreement should not have that. So there's no condition, there should not be condition attached to the return of the objects. But I said on our part, we are building new facilities to house these objects. And that is why today in Benin City, we have completed almost a new facility where we can store these objects. They are built to modern standard with all the facilities that are required. And that's what we are doing also in some other countries. They are doing similar things. So this should not be a reason. And if any country feels that such facilities are not available, and I think they have been holding on to these objects for many years, why can't they come up on their own to support building this infrastructure, that they think that these African countries are lacking? This is another way of solving the problem as well on their own part. Right.
So what has been the reception, though, of the artifact of the Benin bronzes back in Nigeria?
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone is, is excited, especially the Benin people are very happy to see the objects. And if you've seen the jubilation, of the communities when they heard about the return of these objects, it's overwhelming. And that is why we said, that all the objects that are returned will go to Benin. And it is from there that first we exhibit these objects so that the communities that have not seen these objects in their lifetime will also be able to see these objects. So that's why we build the new facilities, and we're going to exhibit these objects there. And I hope that the new management of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments will go ahead with this plan so that they, exhibit these objects for the people to see. It's part of their life, part of their social life, and part of royalty. That's why the Oba is also very happy, jubilating. And I think it's something that we should commend those countries that are returning.
On that note, let's take a short break, and when we return, we will explore the efforts of other African countries to reclaim their stolen artifacts and look at the future of this debate. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with this discussion. Still with me, Professor Abba Issa Tijani, former Director General of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in Nigeria, and Ngaire Blackenberg, founder and executive director, Creative Repair Studio. Ngaire, I want to come to you here because at the time of handing over the Benin bronzes to Nigeria a few years ago, Germany's Culture Commissioner Claudia Roth said it marks a turning point in international cultural policy. What exactly has changed since then in the debate or in the momentum to return Africa's artifacts?
Look, I think what's really great is that there have been some very successful restitutions, that there have been some works that have found themselves back in Africa and to communities where they belong. And I think that that's been really positive. I think there's been a huge rise in public awareness around this issue. Not sure whether it was just the return from Germany, but also films like The Black Panther and artists doing a lot of work to highlight this issue. African artists and diasporic artists have been working really hard to bring this issues to the fore, as have activists, as have academics, curators, etc. So there's really been, I think, a groundswell of pressure in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, New Zealand, and in Europe. So I think that that's a really positive thing. That being said, however, there has been some real dragging of feet. And so even though there has been a lot of noise in terms of media, when you start to count what is actually being returned, that is another question.
Professor Tijani, so what are some of the challenges, though, that European museums are facing when they are considering repatriation of African artifacts? Are there, for example, specific laws that are protecting these museums and their rights to retain these objects?
Yes, of course, there are some countries like Austria and Switzerland. They have legislation that is stopping repatriation of of these objects, and these two countries have now taken measures to repeal those legislation to allow repatriation. But United Kingdom is one of those countries that has not done that. Is still insisting that the Act of Parliament in respect of the British Museum is still there, and they are not willing to repatriate. But I think it's a matter of time because it's a new chapter, it's a new dawn, and I think countries that are agreeing to return these objects are overwhelming. There are many, so Britain should not be alone. And also, France has a similar issue. They also have legislation that is stopping repatriation. And I know that President Macron gave the go-ahead for some of these objects to return to Benin Republic. I think about 25 of them were returned. But I think the legislation has not been addressed. This was just a unilateral, sort of agreement by the president to return them. But I think the legislation is there, and we have so many Benin bronzes also in museums in France, and we are facing that challenge as well.
Right. Ngaire, what's your view?
I think all museums have policies that certainly guide what can be deaccessioned and what cannot be. And I think all museums should have those kind of policies, because museums are there to protect things for the public good, and they shouldn't be able to just get rid of things as they will. So I think those are good. However, I think policies can be changed to reflect more contemporary realities, and I think legislation can also be changed if there's a will to do so. I think on our end, on the continent, certainly, I mean, there's a lot that has happened since colonization, and colonization by design has disrupted communities, disempowered people, silenced voices, marginalized people, killed people. And so tracing, for example, provenance is definitely challenging. And that's the thing that a lot of museums, I think, are hanging on to. There's a lot of money going into research projects around provenance. How can we trace where this came? Where did it come from? Et cetera, et cetera. And what that's done is it's really slowed things down, because, I mean, that can take 10, 20, 30 years, and you may never know. So there has to be a little bit of a leap of faith made, but also an acknowledgement that actually Europeans and European museums are not the arbiters of morality when it comes to this issue, nor are they the arbiters of who should receive and in what context should things be received. I mean, you don't steal somebody's car and say, well, I can look after it better, but if you want, you can come and look at it at my house. I mean, it's just those are not terms for you to dictate. So I think also there's this insistence in many European countries that these things be negotiated from a nation-to-nation level, when things were often taken before the nation-state was even formed. And so countries are refusing to work with communities, for example, and only insisting on going through a certain level of government when leadership and governance is constituted completely different in many different countries in Africa. And so I think that if there is a genuine will to transcend some of these issues and to understand that there doesn't have to be a perfect situation where the Europeans think everything is in place to return them, then I think that this can speed up a lot more. I think the most important thing here is to just understand who is calling the shots and who is saying which conditions need to be fulfilled for this action to take place.
Right. Professor Tijani, so let's look at Africa's side for a minute, because given the thousands of artifacts that were taken away from across the continent, is there an argument that can be made in favor of an Africa-wide approach to demanding the return of these pieces, as opposed to individual countries or institutions negotiating separately?
No, there is various committees at the African level where these issues are being addressed. The African Union has a committee that are set up to address this issue of repatriation, to support countries, but also to have one voice. And also at the ECOWAS level, for example, the regional level, we know that ECOWAS has a committee. I'm a member of that committee, and we just met last 2 weeks. So we are addressing this issue, and the ECOWAS Commission has already passed a resolution, and it's the ECOWAS resolution that set up this committee to address the issue of repatriation, support countries, and negotiate on behalf of countries. So at the African region, we are actually working as one to address this issue.
Right. Ngaire, what's your view?
Absolutely, and in fact the African Union does have a common position paper that it's distributing amongst its members, and great effort is being made on the continent for people to talk to one another and come together to be able to address this issue as a whole, as Europe is doing. The European Union is doing a lot of conversations at the moment around this issue as well. The Thabo Mbeki Presidential Center, an initiative of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, for example, has a mission to catalyze the African Renaissance and is in a Pan-African initiative. And part of their mandate is a cultural restitution project, and to provide some leadership around that is necessarily around working together with all the different stakeholders in this issue on the continent. It's a continent-wide response to different European museums and American museums in this conversation.
So how do you see this debate, Professor Tijani? How do you see this, the future of this debate? Do you see European museums ultimately giving in to demands by Africa, or will they continue to resist?
No, I think ultimately I believe that all objects that are illegally taken out of Africa will be returned to Africa. And my belief is that many of the European, citizens are not happy with the situation, especially when they go to museums and see objects on display that are illegally taken out of the country. And we have been saying that many of these objects that are on display in European museums and are not conveying the right message about the objects and the community that these objects are taken from. So we want to change the narratives. We want to see that these objects portray, the right, information and the history behind these objects, so that, people will be well informed and we get to understand about the cultural identity of these communities as well.
Ngaire, as we come to the end of this program, how do you see the future of this debate?
Well, hopefully we'll see really more restitution, more reparations, great deal of institutions being built, being supported, being resourced on the continent, and more equitable relationships being formed between Europe and Africa, or the US and Africa, which allows for the circulation of work on a loan basis, on an equitable basis, co-produced exhibitions. Hopefully we'll see more and more artists being inspired to learn about this work, to receive it when it comes back. We hope to see improvements in art education across the continent. I think there's all those things that one can hope for. I can't really predict the future because it's very hard to figure out where things will go. And for every positive hope, we also have a doomsday scenario. But I do think that we will prevail in the end.
Right. As a final comment, Professor Tijani, we are winding up the program. What would be your message to European institutions as well as to the continent in terms of the demand or the request of Africa's artifacts?
The European countries should understand that time has changed. We are in a generation that is well informed with a lot of social media and so on, and people communicate and so on, and they should do the right thing. The right thing is to return the objects that are illegally taken out of Africa. And what they need to understand is that when we get these objects, we are not going to empty their shelves. We are going to give them some of the objects on loan. And more so, what they have on display is probably 1% or 2% of the total number of objects in their collection. So therefore, they're not going to miss much. So they will still have the objects to display. So I think that way, because we want our objects to be ambassadors, of our countries and of our communities. So it is the right thing, ethically, professionally, they should do the right thing. But also to the African, countries, African heads of government, please let them understand that in Africa we cherish our culture, and our culture is our identity. And therefore, anything that they do, they should support this repatriation. They should provide funding so that we will be able to carry out our job properly. Because we know that we have some economic challenges, and there are so much given attention to economy and on other things. But I think culture is also very important. It's part of our identity. It promotes peaceful coexistence, among communities, and it promotes identity, and it stops some social vices. Because once the Europeans see that we Africans are united and we really want our object back, there's nothing they can do but to succumb.
Indeed, but that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts, Professor Abba Issa Tijani, former Director General of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in Nigeria, and Ngaire Blackenberg, Founder and Executive Director, Creative Repair Studio. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, bye-bye.